Welcome back, friends, to the OFFbit. Today we're going to be looking at the HD5850 by AMD. We're going to be running through the regular stress test, benchmarking this puppy, and seeing what games it can run in 2020. So stick around. The Radeon HD5850, released back in September 30, 2009. Codenamed Cypress Pro, this card's based on the 14nm fabrication. The particular card we're looking at today is the Gigabyte GV-R5850 OC-1GD. This version's core clock runs at 765 MHz. The memory clock is clocked at 400 MHz and has 1 GB of GDDR5 on a 256-bit bus. It supports Direct3D version 11, OpenCL version 1.2, and OpenGL version 4.5. We're running our standard test bench today, the i5-760. This is a standard Intel quad-core chip. It's running off a H55M motherboard from Gigabyte, and we have 8GB of RAM. We are running our standard drives as usual. We have the 1TB Western Digital Green magnetic drive and our 2 Western Digital Green SSDs, one 240GB and one 120GB. Power supply today we're using is from Antec. It's the Trio True Power. It's a 550 watt power supply. Alright, we're done with the specs. Let's move on to benchmarking. Our first benchmark is Unity in Heaven. We scored 266 points on the 5850. Leaving it about halfway from the GTX 750 and almost double the 5770. Bench R15, the HD5850 scored 60.8 frames per second. Interestingly, the card pulled out in front of a GTX 750. Now I'm pretty sure that GTX 750 was the Q600 test, so we will revisit that one with an i5. 3 Mark V strike, the HD5850 scored 2,320 points. Now I find this benchmark probably the best reflective of where the GPUs actually sit. So we're behind the 570 and we're behind the GTX 750. Now I do think that GTX 750 I need to revisit with a faster CPU because I think that was the bottleneck on that test. Now the games, we're going to start up with Rocket League as we're already running in the background. Rocket League ran perfectly smooth. It felt just like a fast machine. There was no problems with it. Now we did have the settings set to default settings, so we didn't turn anything up or down, so it was probably medium. Frame rate sat around 57 frames per second. Our minimums were 34.5 and our 0.1% lows were 11.5. So the game ran pretty good. So no problem, HD5850. It's a thumbs up for Rocket League. Blizzard's Overwatch, the HD5870 ran pretty good with this game as well. We averaged about 69.4 frames per second. We did have our 0.1% lows at 4.5 frames per second. So yeah, every now and then it would load something and it would slow down a whole heap. But generally, the playing experience, fine. Now we were set to pretty low settings and we were running 1920 by 1080 for our resolution, as for most of these tests today, but there is one game we didn't. Fortnite ran okay, nothing fantastic. We got an average frame rate of 44.9. See you later, Platinum Pony. So yeah, game ran okay. We got a frame rate on average of 44.9 frames per second. Our minimums were 13.7, maximum was 59.8, and our 0.1% lows for this game was 1.9. So Nothing fantastic. Still very playable for most of it. Look, if you had this card and you run everything on low, I don't think you'd be too disappointed with its performance. I had a good game for about half an hour playing Fortnite, and I didn't really have any problems playing with it. Okay, heading into PUBG, we averaged a frame rate of 40.7 frames per second and maxed out at 106.8. Now this game ran pretty good for the most of it. It did have some big dips at times with loading, with the 0.1% lows at 1.5 frames per second. However, I had a pretty good game of this. I lasted pretty good. Look, it's just every now and then you'll pull up a scope, or you'll walk into an area, or you'll pull out the equipment, and it just has to load something. So, in critical times, it could hurt, but for most of it, wasn't too bad. So we had run this game at 1080p, and the visuals or the graphic levels were set to very low. You have to excuse my terrible shooting here. I do apologize. Believe it or not, I do finally get him. Okay, next up we jump into Apex Legends. Now, I don't know what it is about this game. If it's just the region I live in, I just can never find a server. So we ended up just going into the shooting range to run it. So this is one of those games we had to run at 720p. It just seems to be a lot heavier. All our details are set to pretty low, and it basically netted us an average frame rate of 49.3 frames per second. Our 0.1% lows of 15.1, so it didn't actually do too bad for loading, but that might be because we're just in this area, like it's just the firing range. Now I think this game would run pretty fine on this, even in a normal match, so I'd give this a thumbs up for the HD5850. But you'll need to make sure you keep the resolution at 720p and graphics down low. Another classic, the old Hereos of the Storm by Blizzard. This game pretty much runs fine on most machines with some sort of graphics card. Average frame rate for Hereos of the Storm was 66.2 frames per second. Look, we did have 0.1% lows at 3.9 frames per second, so it did chug every now and then with loading stuff, but for the most of it, I didn't even notice. I played this game for about half an hour, running this card, and I had no problems. It ran perfectly fine. We are running 1920 by 1080p with default graphics settings, so it's not really turned down. It's probably sitting somewhere on the higher side.
Nicely done.
Next up on the list, we jumped into Rare's title, Sea of Thieves. We ran this game at 1920 by 1080p. The settings were set to cursed, or better known as very low. Now this being one of the best adventure games I think you could have with a couple of buddies. And running with the HD5850, I think you would do okay with that. Now, the game ran pretty much on average about 45 frames per second across the board. It did have some dips. 0.1% lows were 8.7 frames per second. Now, the minimum frame rate's at 24.3 and our maximum at 63.2. So, Most of the time, this game ran fine. Now, I don't know what it would be like in a big battle. I think you would see some of those bigger dips, and you may get a bit frustrated. But with a few buddies, I don't think you care. This game is a lot of fun. And if you were running into problems with bigger battles, you can still drop back to 720p resolution or even go back even further. So there's still some wiggle room to pull out a few more frames with this video card.
That's all I remember.
Now finally we move on to Minecraft Bedrock Edition, or better known as Minecraft Windows 10 Edition. Now this game always seems to have a 60 frame cap. Now that might be just my monitor because it's a 60 frames per second monitor or 60 hertz. So other than that, this game pretty much runs on a potato. I've said it once before in a few other videos, it basically can run on nothing. Our 0.1% lowest was 24 frames per second, and our maximum was 60.9. So that just gives you an idea where we're sitting. We did drop down to 45.6 on our minimums, but the average always sat almost at 60 frames per second, which is pretty much perfect. Now, I did notice there is a slight problem with this HD5850. Now, it's just this card. It's got nothing to do with across the board. It's just there's something has died a little bit on this card, and you get a lot of image tearing. So you can see this happening now. So generally this did this more at the desktop than inside games, but in Minecraft it just went nuts at times. Alright, well let's wrap this up. The HD5850 for 2020, still kicking goals in my book. Yes, you'll have to pull some of those pretty graphics back. Maybe that's pulling the 1080p back to 720p, or just turning some of those pretty things down to very low. I generally find I like a higher frame rate over prettiness when it comes to games. Now, that might be because I generally play more online competitive gaming, and it's paramount to have a good frame rate to play that stuff. And I think if you're willing to make the sacrifice of graphics, you can still play 2020 games competitively. Now that's all I got today for the OFFbit. Now if you got any questions or anything you want to chat about in regards to HD5850s or some of your fun experiences that you've had in the past, or even something that you're doing for a future project, there is the comments down there. I do love reading them. I do love conversing with these guys, so please leave a line. So if you like this video, please hit the like button, and if you want to see more of this content, hit the subscribe button. It's very encouraging for me to keep making these videos, this content for you guys. Alright, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time on the OFFbit.